On behalf of Interfaith Action, welcome. Working session number 2. My name is Sarah Paterka. I'm the Director of Opportunity St. Paul and Congregational Engagement. On behalf of our leadership team between Interfaith Action and the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, welcome. We're going to get started here right now. It's my honor to introduce my Executive Director, Randy Ross at Interfaith Action. She's going to introduce our evaluation team, who will take it from here to share those first initial conversation results for a little bit. So Randy, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's wonderful to see it. It's wonderful to have to flip through multiple screens to see everyone. What a great turnout. Wonderful, wonderful to be with you. And it's my great honor to introduce both Michael Quinn Patton, and Charmaine Campbell Patton. And I'm going to do a less formal introduction for Michael and a more formal interview for Charmaine. So for Michael, who I've greatly enjoyed working with, I think maybe literally for decades now, I'm going to say that Michael really launched the field of evaluation studies. He started the PhD program at the University of Minnesota and taught in it for decades. He's the author of almost every foundational textbook on evaluation, and he's just the guy. He is a past president of the American Evaluation Association. And to me, the great thing about working with Michael, and the reason I always want to bring him into everything I can, is he looks at the work from the perspective of the people on the ground trying to make the world a better place. He brings his science to it. He pushes you, he challenges you, he messes up what you were going to do and lets it fall back into place in a better way. So it's not like he's just going to sign off on what you're doing, but he's not a report card evaluator. He's not a guy who says, you do it, and then I'll tell you whether you did it right. He's in there with you from square one, making it happen in the way that's best for the community, drawing on lessons from all around the world. Right now, he's evaluating climate change for, I think, 23 countries. He's run for many years the Ford Foundation's Evaluation Studies Institute. He is the lead evaluator for several multi-billion-dollar foundations, and he's here with us, and it's a great honor to have him here. Charmaine Campbell Patton is a second-generation evaluator with 12th generation European settler based in Minnesota, USA. Her professional experience spans 15 years of program design, implementation, and evaluation work across a range of fields, including youth engagement, education, criminal and juvenile justice, and philanthropy. She specializes in qualitative research methods and utilization-focused developmental evaluation. She's a co-founder of Blue Marble Think of the Earth Evaluation Network. Charmaine holds a BA in political science from Grinnell College and an MA in international peace and conflict resolution from American University's School of International Service. She's co-author of the 5th edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation and has written several articles and blog posts on a range of evaluation topics. A global citizen with deep local roots, Charmaine resides near the Mississippi River on Dakota land in Minneapolis with her husband, 2 young children, and cat. Welcome, Michael and Charmaine.
Thank you, Randy. And I am so happy to be with you. And as it said in my bio, I'm a second generation evaluator, which means that I am Michael's daughter. So we are a family team, and we are going to reflect back what you've shared with us so far. So I'm gonna, this is the sort of emergent synthesis of the responses that we've received from you all from your first congregational session. And I'm going to go through them quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but there is a lot there, and we will continue to build on this as we go through this process. So as of yesterday, we had 22 House of Worships with 438 participants having reported to us. These are the ones that we have so far. If you're not on here and think you should be, message me, please. And if you submitted today, which I think at least one of you did, I don't have it in here yet, but I will, so don't panic. But this is really a great starting point. And we want to start with the values that were elevated at the beginning of the conversations. These are the things that rose to the top when your participants first read the dilemma. Safety. This was both the safety of the officer and those involved. Empathy, respect, and trust, both empathy for the police and empathy for the people. Justice and mercy. Life, the value of all life and valuing life equally. Mutual accountability, that there's responsibility and accountability on all sides. The importance of de-escalation, nonviolence, remaining calm. Following protocol and the police procedures. The rights, human rights and civil rights of those in the car. And the presumption of innocence and the importance of challenging any assumptions. These are big umbrella values that rose to the top when your houses of worship first read the scenario, from what I gathered from the reports. And there were many tensions that were then identified within these values. Many of the value tensions that were raised were actually tensions between values and the reality of the situation, which I'm going to get into in the next slide. But when we looked at actual tensions between and among these specific values that were raised, some of them were whose safety? Who are we talking about and whose safety could take priority? There's public safety, the safety of the car occupants, the safety of the officer. And then this contrast between safety and rights. How do you make sure that you uphold safety, but also upholding human rights? And when there's a tension, what is elevated? The interrelationship between accountability, trust, and respect, and the importance of understanding how those are built and potential factors that can hinder them, and when power dynamics come into play as well. This idea of protocol versus empathy, compassion, relationships, and contextualizing things. So when do you follow procedure and when do you potentially go off script? And addressing the immediate situation and addressing the root causes and contextualizing things. Those are some of the value tensions that we saw arise initially in this first conversation. Also, that what came up were many context considerations, as many questions were asked about the scenario that brought up important factors that weren't necessarily presented in the scenario. And what we kind of come back to is what would make a difference to those values when you think about the context. And so some of the big things that people had questions about and wanted to be sure were addressed were the way that fear played out in attention to safety and how fear is very contextualized. Power dynamics of the officer and those in the car, and particularly as they relate to race. A lot of questions around the race and the lack of information about the race of the participants, as well as age. And one mention of gender, with the police officer being named as a woman. A lot of attention to what the public knows and doesn't know, and the importance of public education around how police, how they should and shouldn't act around police, as well as police training. How are police trained? What are they trained to do? And what some folks thought they should be trained in more than they are. The role of trauma and mental health, and when police are asked to respond to situations where mental health is a factor, what is the training there, as well as trauma that police themselves have experienced. the importance of culture and history, what's been happening in communities, the history of policing in communities, as well as the relationship between police and the community, whether police are from the community or not. So there's a lot in here, and these are the big contextual factors that were raised in a lot of the conversations around how they might impact the values that play out. Again, I know I'm going fast, there'll be time to discuss, but I just want to kind of get through the overall picture. Michael, do you want to add anything before I move on to the faith readings?
Just to add for people that what we're doing is documenting what came from you, and that there's clearly behind this, from your reports, a deep sense of your engagement with the scenarios that the commissioner has laid out, taking them seriously, dealing with the complexities of them. And part of what's, I think, interesting and helpful here is the way in which these themes cut across religious communities and houses of worship, to focus on what we have in common around these complexities and dilemmas, and that's what you're hearing.
Then these are some of the faith readings that were used. Some of the notes didn't mention which specific faith reading was used, and so I've changed the form to add that just so we have a little bit more background on that. But these are some of the texts that were used in the text studies. And these are some of the changes that were highlighted after the process. Greater empathy for the car occupants and the challenge of policing. The importance of building stronger relationships between police and community. The recognition that the model of policing that we have right now encourages police to act on suspicion rather than the assumption of innocence. Importance of the officer leading with love, staying calm, and de-escalation. The affirmation of the sanctity of life. The tension between the respect for authority and questioning authority. And the idea of proportionality, that the response should be in proportion to the offense, as well as more attention to potential biases. There were also a lot of comments that the text study didn't change perspectives much, or that they maybe reinforced or expanded what people already thought. And then finally, we looked at priority values at the end once folks had gone through this whole process. And here's what rose to the top from your report: the sanctity of life and safety, the presumption of innocence, justice and equality, mutual respect and responsibility, de-escalation, nonviolence, calm communication, empathy and compassion, and humility. And these are not all that different from the first set of values, but some changes and a little bit of different viewpoints on them. And we have a lot more details on that in our full write-up, but I just wanted to highlight those for you right now. So that's what we're reflecting back from the 22 reports that we received, and we'll continue to add to this. And unless there are questions on that, or Michael, you want to add anything, we'll transition to the process and the feedback we got on process, and then continue to get some of your responses to how the process went rather than just the content. Do you want to add anything before we switch to process, Michael, or any questions?
So our time is short, so go ahead.
Okay. So on the scenario, there were some suggestions that people really got stuck on the scenario, and they spent a lot of time talking about the details and didn't get to the actual text study. So our suggestion is really to focus the questions when there are questions about what is happening or wanting details, to really focus on how that would affect your perception of the values, to really try to keep moving through to allow time. And that goes also to time management, thinking how to, make sure that you're giving enough time to allow participants to really process. And some folks mentioned that they wish they had saved more time. And so now that you've learned, you know, you can think a little bit about how that worked for you and how you might structure your time differently. There was some feedback about the format. Most were done virtually. Some suggested more time built in for processing, as well as potential trigger warnings for the materials, and leaving space for those who are more introverted, finding different ways for people to participate. Some found the text study either didn't get to it or found there were some challenges to which text to use. So we can talk about how to support that process a little bit more. There were some ideas for attendance and participation. Some had lower attendance than hoped for. One of the things that one House of Worship mentioned was that they did personal invitations to really boost attendance. So we can share ideas for that if that's a concern for you. And then generally it seemed like folks felt supported with the process. We've added a note-taking format for you that will be on the website so that we can streamline the notes a little bit more. And if you have other things that you would like support for, we're going to make some time now. I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the process and any support that you need.
Yeah, we'll take just the next couple minutes. Thanks, Charmaine. That was wonderful. And I appreciate the 22 houses of worship and plus others that might not have already brought in and turned in their data conversation notes, however you want to say it. To get those in, the link is still on the website, and we do have this new note-taking format that Charmaine came up with, and that's available to download in a Word doc format on the website as well for you to use to streamline your note-taking to make it easier. But I want to take just this little bit of time to talk about how did the first session go. If you want to unmute yourself or share it in the chat, please do so. We're going to take the next about 5-10 minutes to do that. So feel free to, I'm going to remove these spotlights here, to share or unmute yourself if you want to. I'm going to change my view so I can see everyone. Use your hand raise signal or just unmute yourself and share.
Okay.
So Mary, are you going to go? Mary, you go.
I might as well get started because we'll all sit here and go, oh, I don't know. Our session was small, but it went well. We're a very small congregation. So quite honestly, we were not too concerned about that. We offered both one virtual session and one in person. And then we talked about the, because we had a small number, but if we had a larger number of participants, that we might use a talking stick that's used in circle to help everybody get, that helps the introverts have some time to think, and it gives everybody some time. I find it helps me as a facilitator to stay focused. So sometimes I'm the one that derails the conversation, not the participants.
That's a good tip. Using a talking stick or an object, or leaving space for silence, and allowing folks who are introverted time to step forward. That's a great tip. Thank you, Mary. Anyone, John, you unmuted. Yeah, go ahead.
I say this goes to the fact that Charmaine reported that quite a number of people said that they didn't see the values changing all that much by the faith reading. And it's something we tried to deal with a little bit up front by putting a little different twist on the first question, which was not just what values you think are at stake and intention at the beginning. We add, and this was our minister's, Dwayne Davis's suggestion, that we ask people based on your initial visceral emotional reaction, because we knew that, and I think almost everybody here has the same problem. Most of our congregation is kind of pretty far down the road thinking about these types of scenarios from the perspective of faith values. And so we wanted to tell them kind of put that aside. You'll get your faith reading in a minute. What's your knee-jerk, visceral, emotional reaction? I think that helped a little bit, although we had almost 100 participants. And I would say maybe a dozen or so said that the faith reading didn't change their point of view, but I think it helped a lot of people not think ahead to what the faith reading, how the faith reading would impact, and maybe help them look into themselves and admit what their real gut reaction is.
So true. So true. Great question. Lynn, because your name says Don, but I know you're not.
Thank you. I know. The accounts in Don's name. The same issue that John was just talking about, we dealt with a different way, working from the assumption that for many of us, our faith values are so entwined within us that rather than trying to separate ourselves from them in that initial question, rather than sharing the text, we opened our session by asking our attendees what texts came to their minds as they saw this, given that our texts live within us and have for many of us since we were kids. So we kind of brainstormed, what's it make you think of? Older Testament, Hebrew scriptures, Newer Testament, whatever. And so we tried to surface that perspective before having conversation about it. And that was very interesting, the things that people immediately associated with in their own understanding of our sacred texts.
Wonderful tip, Lynn. Wonderful tip. Rabbi Rubin.
Hi, everyone. We had I think quite a good turnout given the size of our synagogue and a lively discussion. One thing that came up afterwards, I got some email, I received some emails from a number of the participants, is that they felt that we didn't have enough background on, and this came up in the review of, the review that was done earlier. We didn't have enough background on the police perspective, by which I mean the constraints they're under, the training they receive, and the proper procedure they're supposed to go through. There was, of course, that film that that we had in our first session that exists, but I don't know if that really, not everybody got to see it, but even if they did, I'm not sure that really was enough to satisfy what some congregants wanted, which is just more sort of, if we have this scenario, we need to fill out what exactly is supposed to happen. Like some people even thought it might be helpful to have a police officer present, in that discussion. So just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rubin. Great question, great comment. Again, we want to keep focusing on the values that are in conflict with each other. But, if you have police officers in your congregation, invite them. I think their perspective would be great. Catherine.
Hi, thank you. We thought the session went great. I did get the one concern raised by somebody who participated afterwards was that, and I think I might have mentioned it to you too, Sarah, is that this was mainly white congregations. And we are not the ones who are impacted in the same way by over-policing. And so I had reached out to Reverend Babington Johnson. He said he hadn't heard about it. And I just feel like with Stair Step Foundation, his Works United, it's got all the Black congregations in the Twin Cities. And it seemed like they should be part of this conversation if one of the goals is to give feedback to police chiefs on what we should be looking for in police that we're hiring and police that we're training. So but that's not a criticism, it's just a recommendation that we do some intense outreach to that group to get them involved.
Thank you, Catherine. And we will take that into consideration. We did add in about 5 more houses of worship, a couple that are primarily in that North Minneapolis area as well. And so our outreach continues. And your extra outreach helps us as well, as Phil and I can only reach out as far as we can. Glenn, I'm going down the row of the hands.
Right. Good morning, everybody. I felt like we had a really good first session. We had 24 people attend, which I think for our congregation is a good turnout. And it felt like it flowed well. We had booked an hour and a half total, you know, knowing there was going to be the time for kind of like explaining what is this thing, especially the first time for folks. What are we doing? How process all that stuff. I guess I had a little bit of foresight to emphasize up front with them as we went into small group discussions. We had 4 tables of 6 people, so they were small groups, to like, don't get too stuck on the details and the scenario. Just, you know, you don't have to play it out in detail, just talk about more like the values and what's going on. And that seemed to go well. Time management, yeah, we didn't show any of the videos because I didn't want people to get stuck on like the traffic stop video and what is police procedure when we want them to talk about values. Plus, technology always blows up, and you know, then you're going to waste a bunch of time. And even at, you know, with my work folks, it's just kind of like, especially these days with the pandemic and everything, is like minimize the amount of time that people are watching something or listening to a presentation, and maximize the amount of time people are actually talking to each other. So there wasn't a whole lot of, you know, presentation. It was just setting it up, reading the scenario, and then I gave them 20 minutes to talk, and it was not quiet. The groups went on for the full 20 minutes. Then we did the text study, and I gave them 15 minutes after that. That was a good amount of time. And then we had in between a little bit of group sort of report out and conversation. And it seemed like it flowed really well. And I think people at the end, I just kind of asked, how was this? Was this good? Was it? And everyone was immediately like, yes, this is good. People want to talk about this. We did not offer a virtual option. It was just an in-person thing. And I like that idea of someone said about make a trigger warning, you know, because I hadn't thought of that, but like the very first session we did where it was more of a mental health scenario, I had some triggers with that from past experiences in my life. And and I didn't think about doing that for this time. Someone may have had a traffic stop, you know, experience in their life that this could have been a trigger for. So I think I'm going to try to remember to do that. Like, this scenario is generically about this, so be ready for that. I like that idea. And I like the other suggestion somebody made about having people first respond with, what's your visceral reaction? You know, and I think that goes to, you know, if you're the police officer in that situation, you know, what's your visceral reaction when something happens, the door opens, and what are you supposed to do, or what are you going to do, you know? Or if you're in the car and the police officer comes up, what's your visceral reaction to that? I like that suggestion as well. So I'm going to try to, I think, incorporate those types of things next time around. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Sarah, Reverend Sarah.
Thanks. We had a good turnout at St. Paul's UCC in St. Paul, about 25 people. We, I think at the beginning, struggled a little bit to, my partner, Amber Dahlman, we decided to take some time to say what we mean, you know, to define values, right? Instead of just hopping into, okay, what are we saying when we talk about faith values? And I think that helped, but then we started talking about, you know, interface. This project is seeking to collect data on our values around public safety, right? And we all know why we're doing this is because there has come to light in recent years what, you know, due to cell phones and body cam footage and all these things, what is actually happening within police departments, and some of the insidious racialization of policing. And so when we got to the part about, I used the texts and the example from James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I wasn't surprised by the reaction, but I don't think, especially within progressive communities, and even if we've talked about racial issues in the past, I think there's always this barricade or this thing that you have to overcome in these conversations when essentially saying, comparing the cross to the lynching tree, well, it really forces people to be confronted by what the cross means. And I felt like that sort of, it really, I think it did what it was supposed to do, right? It connected the public safety conversation in a really intense way with people who really care about their faith. But because we had started off the conversation talking about collecting data and how we want your visceral gut reactions, I think they felt a bit of a, like, wait, I thought we were just getting data here, and now we're really getting into the heart of my faith and being confronted by the reality of the cross. And that's not a bad thing, but it went from one thing to another pretty quickly. So I thought I would just, and luckily we got through it, and it was good and productive, but yeah, just interesting how that process did do that little loopy line thing. So
that squiggly line. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Toya.
Sorry, it took me a minute to get off mute.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
Sorry, I don't have my camera on because I'm recovering from a cold, and I feel like I look like a hot mess. So I apologize.
You sound a little raspy. So go ahead.
I just wanted to, I guess, a couple of comments. So I'm with St. Anthony Park Lutheran, and my pastor is actually on this call as well. We did one session, and I think I can't speak to the text. I think that it went well because we started with the youth. I think the most important piece from a youth perspective is that, these kids go to school in St. Paul, and they, are around their peers of color. Catherine had mentioned earlier that her congregation is an all-white congregation. Well, so is mine, with the exception of my family. So even though I think when you are looking at an exercise like this, and you're talking about, what potential things can we do as a community to help change the way that we see, the police and how they do their jobs. I think for people of color like myself and for my family, it's important that white congregations understand what we go through, right? Having this exercise and kind of just going through the motions and trying to figure out, like, what is your gut reaction to this scenario, which might be leaving out some very pertinent details, right? You might be looking at it from your perspective, as a white person, or, another person of color, or, any other ethnicity, and thinking that it doesn't apply to you. But then if you put your feet in someone else's shoes and go, well, what would it look like if it were my friend who doesn't look like me? How could this scenario play out or not play out, right? And I think in order for us to even begin to see change in a way that will make things in the future be easier and put people back at ease with, dealing with the police, or feeling like they can trust law enforcement, we need like all hands on deck, and we need everybody's support to make that happen. Churches of color we're not the ones who make the laws, but we need everybody to change them, right? So it's important, I think, for all congregations, regardless of whether you're a congregation that's, all Black or not, to be able to understand how this impacts your neighbor. But I think our youth took it in. I think our youth did a great job. They're really into, justice and reform of all kinds. And it was cool to watch them sit and brainstorm these scenarios and use it in conjunction with the text and see how it changed or didn't change their outlook. And I think it helps that they know that there is a family in their congregation who has been affected by, police, not brutality necessarily, but has been affected by a death at the hands of police. And they can look at it from that perspective and go, So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Victoria, thank you. And it's great to hear that St. Anthony Park Lutheran held a youth conversation. Very important voice to hear. As always, Phil and I, Phil Romine, my trusted colleague, we're here if you want to debrief after or before your session, or if you have questions, use us as a resource. Phil's an ordained minister, and I spent 20 years doing children, youth, and family ministry. So we've both facilitated conversations similar to this. So feel free to use us as your resources as you're planning the next conversation. I've heard great things. We'll put together a little summary of your feedback and send that out this week with the links to our second scenario. Speaking of resources, we added a PDF about why this is important, transcribing Commissioner Harrington's answer from that question from our first session. It's available on PDF. You were emailed it as well. And then along with all of our resources on the Building the Beloved Community Public Safety webpage on our website, all of the videos are there. All of the dilemmas are there. Curriculum source books are there as well. Along with, we also created a step-by-step guide of how the conversations to flow. But I'm about to take that down and redo it after this conversation. So great conversation. I want to thank you for that. It's that time of the morning to introduce Commissioner Harrington, to have him share any words before we watch the second dilemma video and be introduced into the second story. Taking a little feedback, here's your content warning. Our second dilemma story has to do with domestic violence and unsheltered families. So just a little heads up that might be a nice warning to say when you share this video and the dilemma story with your congregations. But I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Harrington.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the feedback. I want you to know that because I listened to some of the conversations just when we were doing the online part, a lot of your feedback is already resonating in the houses of the legislature and in conversations we're having with the governor and others. So, but I just want to thank you, first of all, for joining me and Interfaith and our beloved community public safety discussions. The feedback from your first dilemma really has helped craft our legislative ask, for example. So, for example, we've asked for $300 million to go to communities, non-specified, so that local communities can decide what do they need to make things safe. That could be more police, it could be more firefighters, but it also could be mental health professionals, social workers, it could be safe places for youth to come to, it could be more juvenile services, it could be whatever that community thinks will help make them safer. And so I think that's a really important component of these conversations. We've also proposed, I really did appreciate, because I don't think of the backup officer in that first scenario. It just occurs to me that, because I've always been a cop, that there's always a cop coming. Sometimes they're coming from 100 miles away. Most times in my St. Paul history, they were within 5 minutes or so. But we have proposed recruiting efforts to help restore police staffing to the levels that will enhance safety for both the officer and the community. We proposed a state body cam system where we would be the host for body cams so that every department could have body cams. And we think that would really enhance both transparency for communities that are concerned about what police are doing, but it'll also enhance accountability so that chiefs of police can hold police officers accountable if and when they do things that are outside of the bounds of our value system. And finally, there's funds there to enhance training options based largely out of the Camden, New Jersey model that I don't think we've spoken a lot about, but it's a model where I learned about an enlightened response to mental health where everybody goes home at the end of a mental health crisis call. and where sanctity of life, that's really the place that I heard that term first mentioned, was out of Camden. As they said that was the base value for how their police would interact with the community. So again, I want to thank Interfaith for all their hard work, Sarah and Randy and everybody. And I really do think we've come a long way on this. I will mention that in our first conversation, I talked about the importance of traffic stops for traffic safety. But what I didn't necessarily mention was how dangerous they are. I think your comments trying to trigger that in me, basically. There were 58 officers killed over the last decade from traffic accidents. And the only cases that are probably more dangerous than responding to traffic stops are those involving family violence. We saw 43 officers killed nationally due to assaults in that kind of venue. In the past 3 months here in the Twin Cities area, we've seen an ugly spike in domestic violence. Over a third of the murders in St. Paul this year, they were committed on women, and they are domestic violence situations, and they are horrendous. We've also seen homelessness. It dropped overall because of COVID, we think, but there's almost 8,000 Minnesotans experiencing homelessness on any given day. I want you to think about that in terms of, that's a Saints ball game. Think about how many people that is. And while I said as it dropped, part of what I recognize and from our conversations, 6 out of 10 homeless adults have experienced physical or sexual violence, and that's what prompted some of them to become homeless. And women and people who identify with LGBTQ experience this violence at even higher rate. So I want to preface the scenario today with those comments, because I think it's important for us to think about that, some of what police work is involved with is about law. It's about enforcing the law. But a lot of what I've done over my career is about keeping the peace. And this is where this traffic stop and this scenario, I think, really speaks to. It doesn't speak to a legal question as much as it does speak to how do we keep people safe. And she's got the go button, so I assume she's going to hit it. So.
Greetings and salutations. I'm John Harrington, the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. And I want to thank you for joining me as we come together to have another beloved community public safety discussion. Again, I want to thank Interfaith for all their hard work on this, and to say thank you to all of our faith leaders and the congregations who are participating in these beloved community conversations. Our dilemma today starts very simply with Officer Johnson, who has been working patrol for 5 years. She's assigned to the uniform patrol and has an area that includes an elementary school and a high school and some residential and some commercial properties. After roll call, she leaves the station and is driving patrol, working the afternoon shift. School has reported an SUV parked in the school lot overnight with people coming and going from it. And Johnson, as she's on patrol, gets a call on a verbal domestic in a car parked in an area strip mall, not too far from the school. She arrives at the mall and sees an SUV parked near a store. Johnson can hear voices from the vehicle shouting and cursing from within the SUV, and she turns on her lights and pulls in behind the car. Officer Johnson notices the car has no rear plate. Officer Johnson's backup arrives and also checks out with dispatch, and the officers approach the car and can see the car has suitcases and garbage bags packed throughout. 2 adults and 3 children are inside the car, and they appear to have been living in the car. They can hear someone in the car say, "Nobody says a word but me." Officer Johnson walks up to the driver's door, activates her body-worn camera, and sees a black male who appears to be about 30 years old, and she asks him for his license and car registration and insurance information. An Asian female adult in the front seat appears to have been crying and has a swollen right eye. The driver gives Johnson several documents and asks why he was pulled over. So Officer Johnson begins to examine the documents. She sees what looks like a cut across the driver's knuckles. The rear passenger door opens, and then 2 children get out and say that Daddy hit Mommy, and the children are crying. What should Officer Johnson do now? As you think about this dilemma, a few things that a peace officer might consider. Number one, parking at a public school is not a crime. But as a beat cop or a beat officer, one would know the school and the businesses around it have safety concerns. And you know that parents worry about child safety, and that concern isn't to be lightly dismissed. They might ask you the question, does that car hold a pedophile or a person with a weapon that might hurt kids coming to and from the building? Thus, a car parked overnight could be seen as a safety hazard, even though it's committing no real crime. Number two, being a person experiencing homelessness is not a crime. But you should know that police are often asked to interact with people who are unsheltered. Often when people are unsheltered, they camp on private property, and when that happens, police are called to remove them. Even when they're on public property, police are called to intervene when people experiencing homelessness are victims and or sometimes perpetrators of violence and crime. I can remember my officers when I was at Transit Police were taking a report from a homeless woman, an unsheltered woman, who had been fleeing domestic violence and been living on one of the LRT trains. She awoke to find herself being molested by a man. The man was also unsheltered. Imagine a life lived without the walls that we all call home. When I was chief, as I said, at Transit, we created a homeless action team dedicated to addressing increasing reports of abuse, including sexual and family violence on trains, including domestic, child abuse, and child welfare, along with elder abuse that occurred on transit, sometimes on the platforms, sometimes in the buses, sometimes on the trains, as I've said. One of my aha moments working with people experiencing homelessness was when we were working on the light rail system. And we found that the trains themselves had become camping grounds, as had the platforms. When my HAT team began trying to find housing options, we confronted what I now know of as the 3 Ps. Shelters don't accommodate pets, property, and sometimes partners. Imagine being a person experiencing homelessness and having to make that Solomon-like decision of which of your children you can bring with you. 16-year-old boys are often not allowed in women's shelters, for example. And your partner, your adult male partner, married or not, is almost always not going to be allowed in that. And family shelters are rare. Imagine a child telling a child that a beloved pet has to be abandoned when they're already traumatized by having to leave home. The trains, we were told, were viewed as safer by some than sleeping in a car, but the reality is that vehicles are one of the increasingly bad options, I would argue, that people experiencing homelessness are using. Please watch this short video called Hidden Homelessness, Sleeping in Cars.
I don't think any day was the same because we would use our friends and family in their driveway to access power and water to have the van fully functional. The real brute force of waking up and there's no toilet and there's no shower and there's no hot food to make. Everything was upside down and inside out. At 19, I joined the military and started off originally driving heavy vehicles. I have now long-term physical and mental health injuries as a result of my service. I needed to run through 5 years worth of treatment to get myself back to where I wanted to be. And as a part of that, I lost my employment, and further on into that, as things went down and down, I ended up having to sell my home to make things work, then my car, then clothing, whatever I could get together to be able to make ends meet. And eventually one day I turned around and there was nothing left, and I had no choice but to start living in a motorhome with my child. There is so much that is able to stereotype into someone that is sleeping rough with their sleeping bag or, their unkempt hair or something because they haven't had a shower today. But not everyone experiences it in that form. I bet you've probably passed 20 or 30 people already today that have some or experienced in their life some form of homelessness. Most people really honestly look at the small group that are located in the city, that are on the sidewalk and sleeping rough in the city, and all that hidden homelessness that people just don't see because it's not right there on the sidewalk, and that it is so much bigger. People are just can't believe that is happening. So if they can't believe it, why sit there and let it happen? We need to be getting other Victorians to support and vote in the right direction to make sure the government keeps their commitment and makes a difference.
Communities are starting to experiment with different models of how police should respond to homelessness and to the unsheltered. Some have paired police officers with social workers or clinical therapists. Others have created special units to respond to homelessness calls, such as the HAT team. Or sometimes they forward those calls to non-police crisis teams. With more than 500,000 people living without permanent shelter on any given night in America, these efforts are vital. One example that we copied from was in Long Beach, California, where police are just one part of a citywide response that also includes service providers, health officers, park superintendents, city librarians, and even every city department, in fact, can access and share basic data about people they encounter who need help. Name, date of contact, services offered and accepted. That kind of coordinated effort is often what it takes to get results. That's what the city data seems to show. And on average, people experiencing homelessness decline help dozens of times before they agree to enter housing or support services. Here in Minnesota, data privacy laws sometimes make this kind of effort nearly impossible. In our first discussion, we talked about the importance of traffic stops for traffic safety. What I didn't mention was how often traffic stops and traffic results in the deaths of officers. With 58 dead over the last decade from traffic crashes, including traffic crashes, perhaps the only case that is seen as even more dangerous than making traffic stops is responding to calls involving family violence, which resulted in 43 officers killed in the line of duty due to assaults. Domestic violence is at a crisis stage right now. And I'd like you to watch the following video and ask yourself how we as a community can come together as peacemakers and peacekeepers. How police are trained to respond to domestic violence should help you in this discussion. In closing, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. When the world seems to go astray and our human abilities fail, we rely on compassion to offer amazing grace. That grace that surpasses our human understanding. The grace that supports the beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. That is the dilemma video. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, Sarah, I really appreciate it. And it's a little longer than I thought it was going to be. So I appreciate everyone's patience. But we're trying to give you a crash course in policing that will help point you towards the dilemma in a more enlightened fashion. And I can't give you my 40 years of copying, but I'm trying to give you at least a little taste of what it feels like or what it's felt like over that career. So thank you very much. And I'm just looking forward once again to the conversation.
Wonderful. Again, that video is available on the Interfaith Action website under Building the Beloved Community, available to show it to your conversation. I'm going to move it to Earl. Earl, we got about 10 minutes. Does that work for you?
Good.
Wonderful. Earl's going to lead us in the first discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your continued participation in this effort. Before we move to the discussion, I would just like to remind us that the purpose of these moral dilemmas is akin to the purpose of a parable, in that if they work well, they're intended to rattle our foregone conclusions, to shake our footing just enough that we think, and then think again as we work to regain our equilibrium. And in the process, perhaps be more open to something voiced by others that we had not previously understood or had dismissed, voiced by someone from across the table, or as members of faith communities, perhaps from across the centuries. So that what we can offer Commissioner Harrington in return has grown from assumptions and attitude to more informed reflection, tempered by greater awareness and guided by a clearer vision. The purpose of using these narratives in this way is to drive us to think and think again. And what I'd like to do very briefly in the next few minutes is to pose to you some possible questions, not only for our conversation now, but questions that you might in turn find useful as you discuss this dilemma with your congregations as well. These questions, I think, could be organized in terms of what and why, and then testing one's initial responses. So in terms of what questions, based on what they have seen and heard, what should give the officers in this story pause? What are areas of concern? A basic question, which I would then suggest following up with, given these reasons for concern, how would you prioritize the officer's responsibilities? And perhaps actually creating lists, visual lists of those prioritized concerns. Having opened in that way, can I ask very quickly if we could simply state what are clearly the issues, the problems, the elements of the story that a thoughtful officer would pause and consider carefully? I see a comment in chat an initial comment, past and future violence, that in this encounter, we must always consider as agents of a department committed to public safety, the potential for violence in any interaction. Bridget Parenteau says, protection of the woman and their children. And I would say that as you turn from listing these areas of concern to a conversation about prioritizing, the likelihood that members of your community will say, under the circumstances, what goes at the top of the list should be the welfare of the woman and the children, leads immediately and naturally to that second question: why does that come first? Why in this order? And once the whys are on the table, a question about any standards or principles that would have guided your prioritizing these responsibilities in this way. So, with due regard for the short time we have remaining, could I just ask for anyone who would say, in the scenario that Commissioner Harrington has provided us, I would expect that an officer commissioned to look after public safety, first of all, would consider the welfare of the woman and the children. Tell me why that comes first. Can you state it in terms of a guiding principle? Principle that might then guide other comparable decisions. Greatest vulnerability. Wonderful. And I would simply ask then that in your conversations with your congregations, if that arises, there be some consideration of the possibility that greatest vulnerability is in fact a more general concern that should guide an officer of public safety. A calculation of vulnerability and commitment to the needs of the most vulnerable first of all. In light of, as has been noted, that the woman has already been hurt. And so it would appear that we're not only preventing, we're already intervening, along with the need, as Kate Cavett notes, to keep the male in this group calm and the surrounding neighborhood safe. Wonderful. Let me very quickly go to the kinds of testing questions that I think might also be useful to pursue after your conversations in your congregations have dealt with what are the pertinent concerns that a thoughtful officer should keep in mind. How would you prioritize them? Are there any guiding rules or principles that explain why that priority? To testing questions. First of all, what if questions, which are always helpful. What if the officer sees something in the car that adds a new area of concern? A weapon, alcohol, something that changes the story a bit. Would you include any mutual responsibilities that the officers owe each other in your list, keeping in mind that that probably is likely to be on the mind of the officers, if not on the mind of the people in the car? And finally, of course, to return again and again to the question, is there anything about how you have in fact ordered and weighed these responsibilities and then explained why that still leaves you uncomfortable? A question that is always valuable to return to in these conversations. I think with that, I'd like to turn things over initially to Charmaine.
We have the same Mentimeter that we used last time, this time, to have you think about what values should govern the actions of the police in this dilemma. There is a link to it here. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see them pop up as well. So you can go to menti.com and enter the code 8774-2099, or just use the link I put in the chat. We'll wait for some to come up here. De-escalation, keeping the children safe. Safety of children and mother, safety of bystanders, de-escalation at the forefront. Some themes here. Safety and domestic tranquility. Compassion. Care for the whole family in a complex situation. Care for the children and mother. Safety for all persons and respect for all persons without jumping into conclusion of guilt to one party or another. Safety of all people. Compassion, nonviolence, mindfulness, regard for community safety, managing the risk of escalation. Calm approach, protecting women and children without escalating. Care for all family without assuming we know what happened. Getting the mother and children to safety. Vulnerability of family being without shelter. Safety of children, mother, and then broader community. Care for the whole family. Safety of children first, then women. Calm protection. Don't assume anything. De-escalation. Empathy for those discarded by society. One more. Concern for the safety of the most vulnerable, concern for everyone's safety, compassion, keeping an open mind, assessing the car for other information, compassion for neighbors, safety of vulnerable, empathy. Prudence and safety, de-escalation, calm, wisdom, compassion, empathy. Would you like to move to the next question? Okay.
Let's go to the next one.
This is about value conflict. What values do you see in conflict with each other? Everyone's seeing that come up okay on your screen? Need for intervention versus safety of all. Race elements and assumption of guilt versus innocence in our first scenario. Respect everyone's human dignity versus possible need to physically restrain the father. Respect for all people versus protecting the most vulnerable. Paternalism and freedom. Inherent bias versus respect for these individuals. Presumption of innocence versus protecting vulnerable family members. judgment of family for being homeless versus compassion. Immediate needs versus long-term issues, supporting family versus dealing with dysfunction. Protect versus assumptions. Protection of fathers' rights versus protecting women and children. Respect is protection, recognize all voices. Prioritizing safety of people, kids, women, bystanders, man. Do one more and then move on. Assumption of innocence versus obvious abuse having just taken place.
Thank you, Charmaine. We'll get the PDFs of these Mentimeters, and in the recap email that you'll get later this week, have that in there as well, so you can read them and see them. I want to move quickly to our text study. We're honored to have Ben Connolly share in our text study as our leader this time. Ben Connolly is a Soto Zen Buddhist priest. He also teaches mindfulness in secular contexts, including police training, and works with multi-faith groups. He focuses on the intersectionality of liberation, racial justice, and climate justice. Ben is based at Minnesota Zen Meditation Center, and he travels to teach across the United States. He has written for Tricycle and Lion's Roar publication, and is the author of wisdom publications of Inside the Grass Hut, Inside Vasubandhu's Yogacara, and Mindfulness and Intimacy. Please welcome Ben to share our text study.
Hello, I'm grateful to be here with you. I'm grateful for all the wisdom in this group. Our time is kind of short. We want to do breakout rooms, so I'm just gonna jump into a couple texts. I'm gonna read them through, and then we'll make some space for you to reflect on whether those impact on how you respond to this dilemma. First one is from the Kuttadana Sutta, which is about 2,500-year-old Buddhist text. A chaplain said to the king's country is harassed and harried by bandits abroad who pillage the villages and townships and who makes roads unsafe. If the king were to levy a fresh tax, this would be wrong. Perchance the king might think, I'll put a stop to these scoundrels' crimes by degradation, banishment, fines, imprisonment, and death, but they cannot be stopped that way. Those left unpunished would still go harassing the realm. There is one method to adopt to put a thorough end to disorder and crime. Whoever is in the king's realm who devote themselves to keeping cattle and farms, let the king give them food and seed corn. Whoever there are in the realm who devote themselves to trade, let the king give them capital. Whoever there is in the king's realm who devote themselves to government service, let the king give good wages and food. Then each of those following their own business will no longer harass the realm. The king's revenue will go up, the country will be quiet and at peace, and the populace, pleased with one another and happy, dancing with children in their arms, will dwell with open doors. So that's about policing. I'm also going to read one more excerpt from Sherry Maples, who was a police captain with the Madison Police Force, and was also an ordained Buddhist teacher ordained by Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the great Buddhist teachers of our time. This is a story from Sherry. This is a story of going on a domestic violence call. She says, we had a mandatory arrest policy in those days, so if anyone was threatening somebody in a physical way, you had to arrest them. I went on this call and I didn't have any backup, and a woman came running out and said, my husband has my child and I'm really scared. We just broke up and he won't let her come out to be with me. I'm picking her up. We have an agreement about who is supposed to have the child when, and now it's my turn. I asked her to go wait in the car down the block, and I knocked on the door. I'm about 5'3". She's very petite. And this 6'4" man who looked very angry opened the door. I could just see his suffering. It was so obvious to me. In a calm voice, I said, may I come in? I'm here to listen and to help. I came in and saw his daughter, and I said, you know what? I see your little girl over there, and I know you love her, and I know how much you care about her, and I see that she's scared, and I know you don't want that to happen. So how about if we let her go out and be with her mother, and you and I talk? And he did. Rather than escalating the situation to the point where an arrest had to be made, it was just a matter of being compassionate and mindful. I violated policies from the book, and with my gun belt and my bulletproof vest, I sat down next to this guy on the couch, which you're not supposed to do, and he started crying in my arms. This was a powerful experience for me in terms of understanding what a little kindness and compassion can do, that there are alternative ways to respond to people. Of course, when you're angry, irritated, and cynical yourself, it's really hard to see these possibilities. I ran into the same man 3 days later. I was walking down the street that I lived on, and he came up and he said, you saved my life that night. So there's a couple of texts, one an ancient Buddhist text and one from a Buddhist teacher who's also a police captain. And I am going to now just allow you to reflect on this. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. You have 8 minutes, which is a very short time. We kind of were a little over. So I just encourage you, each person, maybe just take 2 or 3 minutes to voice anything that these texts cause you to reflect on. And please do make space for each person to be heard. So enjoy.
Welcome back. Sorry that was such a short period of time, but we've had great conversations throughout this whole morning. So I want to hold on to all of that. As people are coming back in very slowly, we've got just a couple minutes before we wrap. And I want to, when I see Ben pop back up on my screen, give Ben a chance to close us out of the text study.
Oh,
I see. Ben, when you're by Ben, just jump on mute and.
What's that? I'm done. Much love.
Any closing comments?
No, I just heard beautiful things in my group, and I appreciate what everyone's doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We are going to kind of fast forward through the second discussion and jump to the Mentimeter question. So I'm going to turn it over to Charmaine to share her screen. And the first question is, in what ways, if any, did your viewpoint change after your text study? So utilize that same link that was in the chat. I can find it and repopulate it here. That chat, that link. Go ahead and you can say no, like none too. That's okay if your viewpoint didn't change. There you go. Oh.
It's all popping up more so you can see more at a time since we're short on time. The enforced didn't change, affirmed, outwardly show peace rather than preparation for violence. More compassion, reminder to recognize humanity in all people. Risk-taking as part of the presumption of innocence. Imagining possibility of a different kind of police response. Deepened my belief that radical compassion can make all the difference. How an officer can respond in a compassionate way. Calm, compassion.
Wonderful.
All right.
Can we slide to the next? Perfect. What values would you prioritize in this situation after engaging in text studies?
Seeing that come through a lot. Compassion again. Courage, mindfulness. Compassion, safety for most vulnerable. Compassion, resources, empathy, courage, compassion, calm. Officer self-care and training, compassion. that each of the others is made in the image of God and deserves for us to go to the wall to find ways to meet them where they are. Safety, empathy, and compassion. Lots of themes here. Understanding human behavior, self, need for training. That includes compassion, de-escalation. All right.
We've got just two more quick ones. To what extent did the scenario in session deepen your understanding of the challenge of public safety policies and practice? It's a pick one of the three. There we go. And as folks are doing this, we've got one more quick Mentimeter question. I want to thank you all for being with us. Phil, can you put in our website, Beloved Community website, and the link to the PDF? On the Beloved Community website, we have a PDF of the dilemma story. We have the with discussion questions, without discussion questions. The video is available for you to show from there as well. So please utilize those pieces. Here's our last question. How much do you agree or disagree faith-based values can inform public safety decision and action? Phil and I will stay on the call for another, 5-10 minutes. If you have individual questions or questions about your house of worship, we would love to have your next conversation completed and information submitted by May 16th. Again, this will again be given to you via email this week. But we are just excited that we are into dilemma story number 2, and that you are all with us. If there are folks that you feel would be interested, please continue to reach out and let us know if we can help reach out. We'll continue to get folks involved as much as we can. Thank you all. Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. Thank you, Houses of Worship, for being with us today. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you in May for our next working session.